Welcome to day 2 of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology, Series 3. So today's the 23rd of December, that weird no man's land between the solstice and Christmas. I tend to ignore all that, and then I wonder why the shops are shut on the 25th. But here on this channel, I'll be telling some stories which make up the twisted corners of Celtic myth and using them to guide us along some of the scenic routes of Celtic lore. So there were some interesting answers to yesterday's questions. One person said that they find the fluidity of Celtic material liberating. In fact, a couple of people didn't use the word liberating, but said much the same thing. I really like that. And someone else spoke about how much it made them look into themselves and ask, why am I interpreting this myth in this way? So a bit of free therapy, sometimes mythology for sure. In other words, we need to recognize that we are in dialogue with the stories. The myth, it's like a tree. If it falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? A myth does nothing until someone engages with it, tells it, reads it, whatever. Yesterday we met Bran, son of Fieval, whose kingly court was in the north of Ulster, surrounded by a lovely flowering plain. As he and his men sat enjoying themselves one winter night, his druid was seized by the gift of sight and told the company of a wondrous troop of women who dwelt in a well beside a nearby headland. These women were in possession of jewels and enormous treasure, and the druid said it could enrich the kingdom several times over. When we left them yesterday, Bran and his people were making plans for a raid to obtain the treasure. But as we return to the story, years have passed. Bran's chief druid was old now and long past his powers. Unbelievably, Fieval's old prophetess still lived on, and they kept one another company. One day, they were sitting beside Loch Foyle, the vast grey expanse of water which carried the name of Bran's father. The water was the dull color of tin, the waves choppy with the wind. They were silent together for a long time, huddled in their woolen cloaks. And the druid gave a sigh and spoke first. Now that I am old and have been defeated in the contentions over great learning, I can't believe that it was me who made the prophecy of the well. But it was me, was it not? Was it not? And the old prophetess answered him. I remember dark Fieval with his guarded stallion herds. When his eye was upon me, I was not unlovely then. Beautiful were Fieval's plains, lovely the hills around them. Beauty where his folk increased, lovely the music heard there. Fitting that you should lament the displacement of your kin, since Fieval's plain is drowned, since its flowers are but grey waves. Oh, but beautiful the bands of women when Bran's court would assemble. Sweetly the king would bid us at our leaving to return. And then she was silent, and the text of the story too falls silent at this point, leaving me to tell you the story as best I can. Oh, Bran, son of Fieval, what did you do? What force did you offend when you made your assault on the woman troop of the well? Was your prophecy incomplete? Was your druid a little too eager to show his knowledge? Did your father's old prophetess try to dissuade you? Did you approach the other world guided by avarice? You lost everything. The flowering plains of your kingdom were drowned in the angry waters of the well. Now only Loch Foyle stands to preserve your father's name, and the headland of the well is still called Bran. Water oozes from the bank and forms a well there, and once people went there to seek a cure for insanity. So this story that I've been telling you is what scholars have pieced together, not unreasonably, from 32 lines of poetry written down sometime around the 8th century. There are two very good translations of it which are readily available, so I'll put a link in today's notes. And considering its age, the text is surprisingly transparent. The two translations I've been working with are by James Carney and John Carey. And with their similar surnames, it's easy to confuse them, but of course you wouldn't do that. There's been some discussion over the years as to whether the text is from the 8th century or a little earlier or a little later. So let's give that discussion some thought. It centers around the way language is used in the text. The manuscripts that it survives in are more recent than the 8th century, obviously. But as they're nearly exact copies of an original, experts are able to say, aha, they didn't use that bit of grammar in the 7th century, or by the 9th century, no one used this word. Of course, even those arguments are a little inexact, but it gets us close. It's probably around the 8th century. But by dating a text, we're really only saying, well, this story it tells is at least as old as the 8th century. But of course, people might have been telling much the same story for centuries before that, in whatever form of Irish they were using at the time. So I'm spending a little time talking about this because it's going to be kind of important later, but also to get you thinking about the difference between a story, a text, in other words, a group of words, which can be moved from one manuscript to another, and the manuscript itself, so that you can follow discussions about these kinds of things if you want to. The story I told you is basically a paraphrase of this poem, with a bit of me setting the scene and filling in here and there with what scholars seem to agree about what the poem means. I tried not to get too wildly creative, but let's have a quick look at the poem itself. So the two translations are not very different. I've highlighted whichever one I think is a little easier to understand in colored bits, and so that's what I'm going to read, and I'll be diving back and forth between Carney and Carey. So the first 4 stanzas are spoken by Bran's druid, but unlike when I told it to you, what he says is part of his discussion with the prophetess as they look at Loch Foyle and remember the past. So was it I? Was it myself that did not know its kingly generations? I was not a man of little knowledge until I was defeated in the contest. So he's probably talking about poetic contests here, contests of knowledge. When we used to be in Bran's stronghold, drinking in the cold winter, when my knowledge went to the high clouds, it bound strong men in the presence of witnesses. My knowledge reaches a pure well in which is the snare of the troop of hundreds of women. So snare is one of the words that Carney and Carey didn't agree on, but I think Carey's arguments for snare are quite solid ones. Carney calls it equipment, the equipment of the women. But the snare suggests that maybe there's a trap there, you know. The jewels of the shapely company of women would be a great find for the men who would get it. For wonderful are the pure treasures which are besides Bran. It would ennoble a tua, or more than 2 tua. And so a tua is a group of people, a clan, if you like, and tua with an A on the end is the plural. So it would be enough wealth to enable a kingdom or maybe 2 kingdoms, the equivalent of the host of the great world of scions of kingship. Now the prophetess responds because, as you maybe noticed in the title, this is a colloquy, a dialogue between 2 individuals. So This is the stuff I was saying today, my paraphrase of it. Now you can see the original translation. Fival dark and abounding in studs of horses, herded guardingly. The king of Moi Fuinshiri did not think that I was the ugly one of the stock. The translators seem to think that this Fuinshiri is a kind of made-up name for the land which would have been under Loch Foyle, according to the story, the Bran's flowery plains, and that perhaps the scribe or the poet shied away from calling it Moi Fival here. I don't know why for sure. I found the arguments a little bit weak. But anyway, it's just referring to the same plain, the flowery plain. So the king did not think that I was ugly one of the stock. So this is interesting. The druidess, the prophetess, first she speaks about Fival's herds of horses, and then she kind of compares herself to the livestock. The king did not think that I was the ugly one of the stock. In other words, he found her attractive. Beautiful the plains we rode over, beautiful the lands we came to, beautiful the land we thronged, beautiful the music we heard. And now she's addressing the druid. Well do you bewail to companions that our people should flee, seeing that the plain of Fival, so now they call it the plain of Fival, the fair flowering place, is a grey, stony sea. In other words, the land has been covered with water. Beautiful were the bands of women of the assembly in which we were with Bran. Sweetly would the king say, though you go, come back again. So let's see where we are geographically. This is the northern end of Ireland. You can just see Belfast in the lower right-hand corner. Loch Foyle, center top, is quite a big body of water. This story is saying that the loch was created by a flood or inundation as a result of Bran's attempted raid on the Otherworld well. So if we zoom in, here's Loch Foyle, and we can see Sruv here, which literally means Bran's nose, but Sruv is sometimes used in names for a point or a headland. You might be able to make out this little bitty point of land there. So somewhere in this area, there was some kind of a spring and probably a pool. When the text speaks of a well, like don't imagine like a wishing well with a bucket. It's another word for a spring and its pool of water. And Whitley Stokes, the famous Irish scholar, mentions this well in the 19th century, being talked about by scholars previous to him, who say that water oozes from the bank and forms a well, in other words, a pool, near high water mark, to which all the deranged people of the country are wont to resort. In other words, it's kind of a healing well, and I was reading up on it, still exists, and it's known for healing other things besides mental illness, but that's interesting. So according to various things I read, the well is very much still there, but I couldn't find a photo. There are hundreds of St. Colmcille's wells in Ireland and Scotland, and you'll get a better sense as we go on why this well is associated with Colmcille or St. Columba. In Donegal alone, there's something like 20 wells dedicated to this saint. So this one is not the one. It's just up the coast from ours, and you can see that it's completely covered at high tide, which this obviously isn't high tide. But nevertheless, the water is fresh. So there's some interesting geology going on in this area. So this inset here, where you can see a depression with water in it, very poor photograph, is of this little section right here. And the reason the cross is so high is partly because that way you can see where it is when the tide's in. And this is another one up the coast, further around the coast of Sligo, with two sticks to mark its position, two poles, so that it can be seen. There's something quite magical about these, and you can see how they would attract legends. And I wonder whether people thought that because of where they were, that it had once been dry land. And maybe that contributed to the flood stories, I don't know. Coming back toward our story, the idea of a flood happening because a well spirit or something like that has been angered isn't unique to this story. So there's the story of Bran transgressing the rules of Nechtan's well and how the resulting flood created the river Boyne. Bran, wife of Nechtan, son of Lavrid, son of Naa, went with the cupbearers to the well of the green of the fortress. Unless the cupbearers went to the well, no human being would come from it without disgrace. In other words, the cupbearers were supposed to accompany you to the well. Then, with pride and haughtiness, the queen, this is Bran, went alone to the well and said that it had no secret or power unless it could disgrace her shape. And she went round the well withershins thrice, so 3 times anti-clockwise, to perceive the well's power. She's testing it. Is she stronger than the well? Out of the well 3 waves break over her, and suddenly her right thigh and her right hand and her right eye burst, and then she fled out of the fairy mount, fleeing the disgrace and fleeing the well, so that she reached the sea with the water behind her, and in Verbonia drowned her. The story of Sheenan and the creation of the river Shannon, of course, is similar. And Irish lore has many, many stories of lakes bursting forth as a result of some famous event. So this is a well-known one about Loch Orson, which is now called Loch Corrib. So Ilan Rededge, 'tis he that delivered the battle of Quilliu to Manannán, who there was killed. So he's saying, so Ilan Rededge has killed Manannán, who bore 4 names, to wit Gair and Gael and Orson and Manannán. A druid was he too, and a wright and a chapman. So this is describing Manannán. But he was killed in battle and buried upstanding in that place. But the lake burst up under him and overwhelmed the site of the tomb. It's difficult to know what this is saying. This guy has killed Manannán. They bury him apparently standing upright. But then the lake bursts up and overwhelms the site of the tomb. Now, is this Manannán not really dead, making his escape or grand entrance, or is nature angry because of the killing of Manannán? It's difficult to interpret this, but Manannán is going to figure more strongly in the coming days. Starting tomorrow, we're going to look at the more famous voyage of Bran, the one you may know about, and of course Manannán is in that story. If you're enjoying this series, why not take one of my online classes? There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay what you can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter, or follow me on my Patreon page. So now to today's question. There are many stories of land being permanently flooded in Ireland and a few in Wales too. Anthropologists might say that the stories are simply devised to explain why a body of water exists. So that's one explanation, of course, a very prosaic one. Or on one level of understanding, that might be the reason such a story exists. But can you think of other reasons why such stories might be common? Why do you think we have these flood stories? So that's it for today. I'll see you again tomorrow, guys. Thanks for being part of this, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye.